Israel Finkelstein is a leading figure in the archaeology and history of ancient Israel. Over 40 years of fieldwork and research, he has helped to change the way archaeology is conducted, the Bible is interpreted, and the history of Israel is reconstructed. I sat down with Israel over several sessions to talk about how a lifetime of work has informed the story of ancient Israel. Israel, welcome. Today we are changing our venue up a bit. We are at Kiryat Yarim on this beautiful spring day where you've conducted 2 seasons of excavation. Your excavations, of course, have shed a lot of light on the 8th century in Israel and in Judah, which is fitting for today's conversations. Last time, we spent a few days talking about the history and material culture of the Northern Kingdom, including most recently Jeroboam II. And now we want to talk a little bit over the course of several days of some of the texts that were produced in the 8th century or thereabouts. So can you start by giving us a general introduction to some of these northern texts before we get on to the meat of the Jacob and Exodus stories?
Right. The Bible very clearly has northern material in it. There are simply traditions which, when you look at the context, especially the geographical context, they definitely come from the north. The best example, I suppose, is the cycle of heroic stories in the beginning of the book of Judges. The stage setting is all in the northern part, all in the territory of the Northern Kingdom, and the stories must come from there. But this is not all. I mean, there is the Jacob cycle in the book of Genesis, which is played either in Transjordan in the area of the Gilead, the Jabbok River, or near Bethel, Shechem, which means, again, in the territory of the Northern Kingdom, and we will be speaking about Jacob today, later today. And then there are other traditions that come from the north. For instance, just one example from the book of Kings, the cycle of Elijah and Elisha, which definitely is a northern text. Now, and there are more, of course, we will be speaking about them. And in fact, we have already spoken about 2 of them in our conversations. One, the northern tradition, the positive tradition of King Saul as some sort of an early monarch of the north before the rise of the Northern Kingdom. And we already described in one of our past conversations the possibility that the conquest tradition, which as read today is definitely a Judahite one, is based on a tradition that came from the north. Now, the question that we need to discuss during the next few conversations is the following. I mean, there are several questions, in fact. What is the background for the stories, historical background, if we can really identify such a background? Then the next question should be, what is the time of composition? Because there's always a difference between the tradition, which could have been passed orally, and the moment that a tradition like this is being composed, put in writing. And then there are 2 more questions which are important to discuss. How did these traditions, how did they find their way to Judah? Because now they are incorporated in Jerusalemite texts. And what, in fact, is the reason that they were incorporated into the Judahite big tradition that is depicted in the biblical text.
We'll be looking at each of these northern stories in some detail. Can you say a little bit about the time of composition of these things based on all of the textual and archaeological sources that we've discussed so far?
Okay, so we indeed will be discussing the stage setting, the reality behind the stories later when we go into the details of each and every one of them. So regarding the moment of composition, there are several possibilities, of course. One could say that these traditions that came from the north were put in writing after the fall of the Northern Kingdom in order to preserve the memory and the culture, the history, if you wish, of the Northern Kingdom. But I think first and foremost that it is better to understand the composition of these texts on the background of the big prosperity in the Northern Kingdom, probably the biggest prosperity in the first half of the 8th century. We see this prosperity in archaeology. And I think that we see it also from the point of view of territorial expansion and perhaps clues for ideological constructs which have to do with territory in the Northern Kingdom in the first half of the 8th century. So in my opinion, it is more logical to think about collection of, or collecting these traditions, foundation traditions, royal traditions, heroic tales of the Northern Kingdom and compose them in the 8th century BC. It is also more logical to see this as the product of the Northern Kingdom before the fall of the North, because then it is easier to understand how these traditions were brought to the south, to Judah. Otherwise, the whole thing will be in a very short period of time, and we need to open a little bit in order to give these traditions time to appear in Judah. Thirdly, I think that we see already in the first half of the 8th century, not before, but definitely in the first half of the 8th century, ability in the Northern Kingdom to compose biblical texts. We were speaking, if you remember, in one of our previous conversations about writing, and we divided there between Israel and Judah. And we noted that in Israel we do have evidence for composition even of literary texts in the territory of Israel, let's put it, or culture of Israel, let's put it this way, in the first half of the 8th century. So the ability is already there. And finally, there is one more clue which takes me to the 8th century rather than to the later phases of ancient Israelite history. And this is the following. We have very interesting information in the Book of Kings. The Book of Kings lists the monarchs of the north, the monarchs of the south. The Book of Kings, the author, gives the length of reign of each of those kings and the cross references between them, and also refers to historical events. Some of them are supported by extra biblical texts. The best example is maybe the reference to Shishak, king of Egypt, in the Book of Kings when the author describes the time of Rehoboam after the death of Solomon. So one can ask, if all these were put in writing by a Judahite author only in the late 7th century BC, in the time of King Josiah, that author was what, 350 years away from some of the events. How did he know without continuous scribal activity, composition of texts in the two Hebrew kingdoms? And I think that in my opinion, the only way to understand this is to argue, and I'm not the only one who argues this. We will be speaking maybe later about this and refer to other scholars, to argue that there was an early composition of, or lists of kings of Judah and kings of Israel, or rather the other way around, kings of Israel and kings of Judah, and the cross-reference between them in order to promote some sort of ideology of the North, and that this was put in writing in the first half of the 8th century. So then we are only about a century and something from the early events. It makes sense. So according to this assumption, there was an early composition of lists basically in the first half of the 8th century, and then later additions until the Book of Kings received the current shape that we see. So all this together, I think, points to the first half of the 8th century.
With regard to all these northern traditions that you and others suggest are being put down in writing, composed in the early, mid-8th century, are you imagining that there's already some sort of Israelite Bible being composed, or these are smaller texts that are serving a bunch of different purposes in different places?
Yeah, this is a great question. I'm not sure that I can answer, or I'm not sure that anybody can answer. We simply don't know. It is very difficult to say. I suppose that the answer for the time being is negative for one reason. There is the question of how these traditions were preserved until they were put in writing, and even when they were put in writing and before they migrated, so to speak, to Judah. My answer would be that they were preserved in local temples of the north which were associated with given traditions. Let me give you the evident example. The traditions of Jacob were kept in the temple of Penuel in Transjordan and in the temple of Bethel in Cisjordan. Or I suppose that the tradition, had there been a tradition on the conquest in the north, it should have been kept in the temple of Gilgal. So had these traditions been kept in different places, separated from each other, it is difficult for me to argue, it would be difficult to argue that there was one composition of an Israelite Bible.
Right. As you say, many of the stories that we're about to talk about do seem to be foundation stories for specific places, like Bethel and Jacob, for example. With that in mind, how are we going to, what order do you want to go in as we talk about these? Do you have something in mind?
This is, Matt, this is always tricky, whether to, it's always tempting to go with the biblical order, although we know that the biblical order from the historical point of view is not too easy to decipher. But yes, we will go with the biblical order because it makes sense, I think, to those who watch us. However, we have to say right up front that the stories in the Bible, they are set in the order that the authors wanted us to read and believe them, of course, and they make sense from the point of view of the ideology of the later authors. However, they depict different realities from different periods, so not necessarily the older one is indeed the older reality and so on. But still, okay, I suppose that we have to go this way, so we start with the Jacob cycle today, I think, I suggest. Then we turn to Exodus. Then we will probably turn to the heroic tales in the book of Judges. And if we have time, we should speak also about this place, which means the ark narrative in the book of Samuel, and later the composition of the book of Kings.
All the stories that you list here are grouped together by scholars and regular people alike as the era of the patriarchs. So can you give us a little bit of introduction to the patriarchs and some of the background research related to them?
The stories of the patriarchs are wonderful for all of us. We also need to ask why they are so attractive. I think that they are especially attractive because they are very humane. They tell a story of a nation, but they also tell a story of a family. So we all have families, and this is why we are so much attracted to these stories. Now, the Bible is very clear about it. It tells, again, I'm saying this, we have already discussed it, a sequential story, which starts with Abraham, and then goes to Isaac, and then goes to Jacob, and Jacob goes to Egypt, and so on and so forth, you know, until the period of the kings, of the monarchy, of the two Hebrew kingdoms. And we already noticed that we are not committed to this order, but because the order reflects, you know, later ideologies and later needs. However, we need to say that in the beginning of research, many of the, not all, but many of the scholars accepted this order. And if you accept this order, definitely you need to pull back with the patriarchs to sometimes in the second millennium BC, if not before. And why is that? Because it was very tempting to say, if you go with the order, the kingdoms are established in the 10th century BC. David is somewhere around the 11th century. You need to give time to the period of the judges. You pull back, and then you can place the conquest somewhere in the 13th century BC because an Exodus, because of the reference to the city of Ramesses, for instance. If indeed this is the case, you absolutely need to pull back farther in the centuries into sometimes in the earlier late Bronze or the Middle Bronze, if not before. And indeed, scholars were doing just this. They were seeking the realities for the patriarchs in the second millennium and even before, in a way. I would say, I don't want to go into too many details because this endeavor is basically dead, I think. But I should say that there is not a single period in the Bronze Age that, also in the beginning of the Iron Age, that had not been specified or pointed at as the reality for the stories of the patriarchs. So there was a moment in the 70s, because of some findings in Syria at Ebla, that scholars started saying, well, maybe the patriarchs are in the late third millennium BC. And of course, we have to remember Albright and Nelson Glick seeking the patriarchs in the late third millennium, the period of which we call today the Intermediate Bronze Age. And then, of course, there are other scholars, Albright himself later, and Roland Devaux looking for the Middle Bronze Age. And it goes and goes. And Mazar, the Israeli scholar, saying, well, the reality is in the beginning of the Iron Age. All this is dead now. And in fact, what happened is that we made a full cycle back to the ideas which had already been proposed in the 19th century by Wellhausen, for instance, saying that when we read the stories of the patriarchs, the early stories, in fact, we need to look at realities which come from the time of the two Hebrew kingdoms. So from this point of view, all this endeavor in the 20th century, I myself remember, you know, Matt, when I came to study archaeology many years ago, I would say 50 years ago or something like that, I still remember that this was a topic on the table that people were discussing and fighting over in conferences, but it died later slowly.
Why didn't any of these efforts work out? And what was the methodological flaw?
We usually speak about 3 lines of information: ancient Near East, archaeology, and the Bible, and here too. From the ancient Near Eastern point of view, scholars try to identify names and habits described in the book of Genesis with the things that appear in textual corpora from the ancient Near East. For instance, the Mari text of the beginning of the first half of the second millennium, or the Nuzi text a little bit later. But this leads nowhere, because these traditions and names were there for a long period of time. And they can be found, you know, along the centuries in the Bronze Age of the ancient Near East. So this is not really a way to come and identify a moment of the patriarchs during the Bronze Age. From the archaeology point of view, the most important advance is the realization that there is no scribal activity and composition of texts in ancient Israel before 800 BC, as we have already discussed. So if this is the case, how could they know, the authors, about events and realities that took place many centuries before? Because if a tradition is being passed orally, it changes along the way, and in any event, it loses its historical value, so to speak. And from the biblical text, that there is the information within the Bible that scholars, of course, were not blind to see, and they identify this. They identified the fact that from the very early days of scholarship, that Philistines are mentioned in regard of the patriarchs in the book of Genesis, but there are no Philistines in Canaan before the late 12th century BC. And then there are Aramians, and there are no Aramians in the region before also, let's say, the beginning of the Iron Age. And then there are domesticated camels in the stories, and the camels were domesticated probably sometimes in the beginning, in our region at least, in the beginning of the first millennium. So what to do with this? So scholars said, well, all these are anachronisms, which means that there is an old story, and then anachronisms were inserted later into the stories. But in fact, when you come to think of it, the anachronisms are the pillars on which to base the dating of the patriarchal stories. So here we need to say that we should go back to ideas which were expressed as early as the 19th century in Central European scholarship, that the patriarchal stories, in fact, the reality at least, should be sought during the period of the two Hebrew kingdoms.
So how should we deal with the patriarchs?
How should we deal with them? We need to acknowledge what we have already said before, that the Bible is stratified, and the book of Genesis too is stratified. It's not a composition of a moment, that there is an author sitting and putting together the traditions of the patriarchs from Abraham to Jacob, sits in 2 days, writes it, and that's it. He says at the end, I'm done. we are dealing with texts which have probably history of several centuries, and additions and reductions. And we need to try to decipher the continuity here from the very beginning to the way the text looks today. And the way to do it, I think, is to understand first and foremost that originally we are dealing with local text. And of course, I'm not the first one to say this. The great biblical scholar, one of the greatest, Martin Knott, in the middle of last century already suggested that we are dealing, and even before a little bit, suggested that we are dealing here with the local traditions, because if we indeed look at the details of the Jacob story, it is, as we mentioned already, played in the north, in the Gilead, and at Bethel, at Penuel, perhaps Shechem, territory of the northern kingdom. And then when we turn to Abraham, the story is told on the background of the southern territory, the southern kingdom, in fact, and not even Jerusalem, by the way. The core of the Abraham tradition is around Hebron and Mamre, a place we are not going to go into details, but it is in the highlands south of Jerusalem. And the story of Isaac is more in the Beersheba Valley, Shephelah, southern Shephelah region. So local traditions, they have their own geography, and originally they should be understood in this way. So our task is to try to identify the early tradition and first of all understand this phase. And once we understand the first phase, I suppose that it is easier to also locate or identify, read the additions and reductions.
Teasing apart the geography isn't so cut and dry, of course, because even Abraham, whose traditions you say are centered around Hebron, he travels to other places. He goes to Bethel and Shechem, and the same thing with Jacob. He goes to the south as well.
Yes, so you indeed put your hand on the problem and also the solution, in a way. Why am I saying this? Because indeed, I think that the early layer, not only me, by the way, I am telling here the story based on articles which I wrote with my very good friend, also my associate here at Kiryat Yarim, Thomas Romer, the great biblical scholar from the Collège de France. So we published articles on the Abraham and Jacob tradition several years ago, and what I'm saying today is based on this. In any way, Thomas Romer and me, we identified the early layer first, and then, of course, the additions. So the additions, they are interesting because they come already from the period, from the phase where when there is an author that takes the local traditions and weaves them together, stitches them together into one story, which starts with Abraham and continues with Isaac to Jacob, and then he gives them an all-Israelite, if you wish, atmosphere. So Abraham indeed visits places in the north, and Jacob visits places in the south. So this is already part of the ideology of the later authors, and because it is not too far from this pan-Israelite ideology, I suppose that it must be understood as reflecting a period after the fall of the northern kingdom, perhaps in very late monarchic times in Judah. Some scholars would say even later. So we already identified by this, by you pointing this to me, two layers in the patriarchal stories.
All right, with all that in mind, let's dive right into Jacob.
Right, Jacob. I should mention one more thing regarding Jacob. We spoke a minute ago about a later author putting the triad, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob together, weaving the three independent traditions into one story, the story of the patriarchs. Of course, he's a Judahite author, and this is why Abraham rules. Abraham is the most important. He's the father of the nation, father of the family, and father of the nation. I suspect very much that had the author of the final stage been an Israelite, he would have said that Jacob was the first patriarch and most important one, the father of the nation, of course. So we need to keep this, I think, in the background. Yes, we start with Jacob, and Jacob reflects the tradition, one of the two foundation traditions of the northern kingdom. There are two. One is the patriarch Jacob, and the second one is Exodus. We will speak about this in our next discussion, next conversation. These are the two big traditions of the north, foundation, myths of the north. And we know that the Jacob tradition is northern and early, relatively, from different pieces of information. And here we turn from them things that we already discussed before of the moment of composition, we turn now to the moment of reality. What is the reality behind the story? So I think that we need to start by the fact that Jacob is well known to Hosea. And Hosea is a prophet of the 8th century BC, before, of course, the collapse of the northern kingdom. And Hosea writes about Jacob, and Hosea, by the way, in a parenthesis, I should say, doesn't like Jacob so much. So in the big competition of the two foundation myths of the north, I suppose that Hosea is not on the side of Jacob. Let's put it this way. But Hosea mentions Jacob, and he refers to some of the episodes, many of the episodes, and this is very important. Now, I think that the Jacob, when we speak about the Jacob cycle, we need to pay attention, first of all, that the whole story is sort of provides sort of foundation stories for two temples. The temple of Penuel in the Gilead, in Transjordan, and the two El temples, temple of Penuel and the temple of Bethel, north of Jerusalem, also in the territory of the northern kingdom. By the way, Bethel is described in the Bible as the royal temple of the north. Now, I think it is very important to pay attention to the story in chapter 31 in the book of Genesis, in which Jacob is establishing some sort of a border between him and the Aramians. And here it is also the moment to say that in the Jacob tradition we have Jacob and Laban is Aramian somewhere in the northeast, but all of a sudden there is Haran in the story, and there is contradiction there, because Haran is a place in Mesopotamia, far away in the north. And I would go with those biblical scholars and suggest, this is what Thomas Romer and I suggested, that Haran is an introduction in a later phase, that the original story of Jacob indeed plays in the Gilead, and there is no Haran there. Haran is a different story. In the original authentic story, it is about delineating a border between Jacob and the Aramians, Israelites and Aramians, in the Gilead. This was exactly the place where a border like this must have been delineated, so to speak, and when it must have been either on the eve of the rise of the northern kingdom and Damascus, or in the early days when there were inconsistencies or not, the thing was not very clear. So we are here in a reality which can be put on the background, I suppose, of the late 10th century or the 9th century BC.
In fact, the story might even be pushed back a little bit later, because it's more than just a story of the border between Aram and Israel. It's the story of making peace. So it makes sense after the Aramean-Israelite wars.
Or before. I think that after the Aramean-Israelite wars, it's going to be difficult, and this is another point that we need to put on the table regarding the stage setting of the story. First of all, we need to say that there was no control of Israelites over Transjordan after around 750 BC. Even the northern kingdom lost these territories to Damascus, and then of course to Assyria. And Judah never controlled territories east of the Jordan River. So the whole concern with border with the Arameans and so on must be before. So answering your question, I would even pull back a little bit, and this was a good question to ask, because then we can really diminish the possibilities a bit. to the period before the big clashes between Aram, Damascus, and Israel. These clashes started in the 40s, I suppose, of the 9th century BC. So then in the beginning, there is the defeat of Israel in the hands of Hazael, king of Damascus, in 841 in the Battle of Ramoth Gilead. Later, Israel has the upper hand, and then Damascus again in the time of Rezin, king of Damascus. So perhaps indeed in the first half of the 9th century, and even a little bit before, let me give you an example. There is this cooperation, there is this alliance between the Aramians and Israel in the attempt to stop the Assyrian expansion in the middle of the 9th century BC. So maybe the reality should be put there. There is one more issue that we need to discuss here when we try to identify a reality, and this has to do with Bethel. We spoke about the Gilead and the foundation myth of the temple at Penuel. For Penuel, we don't have enough archaeological information. My sense is that I was there, and my sense would be that there is a temple there. In fact, my sense is that Penuel is not much more than a building, a temple, to differ from Machanaim, the town nearby, which is the main city in the region of the Yabok River. But I doubt very much, the way I understand it, whether it is indeed from the late 10th century, from the time of Jeroboam I. It probably was built later, in the 9th or perhaps even better, 8th century BC. But now let me turn to Bethel. Jacob is not only in Transjordan. Jacob migrates, quote unquote, to the territory in Cisjordan between Bethel and Shechem. There is a tradition, first of all, of the burial place at Shechem before Machpelah. So Bethel is important because Bethel had been excavated relatively well, and we know quite a lot about it. It's not a modern report that we can really, go into a historical discussion of minute differences between decades here and decades there, but we know quite a lot. What we see when we take a look at the archaeology of Bethel in a critical archaeological understanding of what we know today about pottery, for instance, it is very clear that Bethel was important in the Iron One, which means in the, let's say, 11th century BC. It was very weakly settled, in fact, possibly not settled at all in the 10th century, in the later phase of the 10th century and beginning of the 9th century, and maybe very sparsely settled in the late 9th century. Bethel becomes important in the 8th century BC. So the background of the story is in the 8th century BC, not to mention that the dream of Jacob at Bethel very much, and of course scholars noticed it, I'm just reciting what great scholars already described, that we have here some sort of influence of Mesopotamian traditions of a ziggurat and so on, the whole tradition that is behind the dream of Jacob at Bethel. So this is also really easy to understand on the background, perhaps of the 8th century BC. So to wrap it all together, the reality is somewhere in the late 10th, beginning of the 9th century, lingering into the beginning of the 8th century, composition in the first half of the 8th century for Jacob.
So how do we proceed from here?
Now we have to ask, what about the Abraham tradition? Because in order to understand Jacob, we need also to decipher Abraham separately, then to relate very shortly to Isaac, because for Isaac there is very little information in the book of Genesis, and finally to try to put them together. But because Abraham is a southern hero, is a southern patriarch, I suggest that we deal with Abraham later when we get to composition of texts in Judah.
Let me guess, we're going to do the Exodus next.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's meet up next time and talk about the Exodus.